Some people steal your property with a bulldozer. Others do it with a ribbon-cutting ceremony. Those were the first words that crossed my mind the moment I saw hundreds of colorful beach umbrellas covering the shoreline my grandfather had spent his entire life protecting. The sharp scent of hospital disinfectant still clung to my jacket as I stood frozen beside my pickup truck, my fingers gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. 15 months. That's how long I'd been gone. 15 months since a drunk driver ran a red light outside Cedar Falls and sent my world into darkness. 15 months in a hospital bed while machines breathed, beeped, and counted time I couldn't remember losing. Every doctor told me recovery would be slow, but nobody warned me that coming home could feel like waking up inside someone else's life. I drove the familiar county road toward Brooks Lake just after sunrise, expecting the same peaceful stretch of water where I learned to fish before I could ride a bicycle. I could still picture the old wooden dock, the weathered boathouse, the tall sycamore tree leaning over the shoreline, and the quiet sound of loons echoing across the water every summer morning. Instead, before I even reached my driveway, I heard music. Loud music. Children laughing. Car doors slamming. Portable generators humming. The smell of sunscreen and grilled hot dogs drifted through my open window. My stomach tightened before my brain could catch up. Then I saw it. A giant wooden sign stood where my grandfather's hand-carved entrance had always been. Welcome to Willow Shores Public Beach. Community property. Beneath it fluttered colorful banners carrying the Willow Ridge HOA logo like it had belonged there forever. My foot slammed the brake pedal so hard the tires crunched across loose gravel. Families crossed the road carrying inflatable rafts. Teenagers hauled coolers toward my lake. Lifeguard chairs overlooked water that had never belonged to anyone except my family. Somebody had dumped truckloads of white sand along my shoreline, replacing native grass my grandfather spent decades preserving. A floating swim platform bobbed 50 yards offshore. Kayaks lined a rental rack beside a brand-new snack stand selling ice cream, bottled water, and souvenir t-shirts with the words Lake Life at Willow Shores printed across the front. I climbed out of the truck, and for a moment the world felt strangely silent even though hundreds of people surrounded me. My boots pressed into soft imported sand instead of the familiar pebbled bank I had walked since childhood. Every step felt wrong. Every breath tasted like someone else's memories. A little boy ran past holding a bright orange bucket and nearly bumped into me before his mother smiled politely. "Excuse us," she said. "We're trying to get a good spot before it gets crowded." Crowded. On my lake. I slowly turned toward the water, barely recognizing the place where my grandfather taught me that land wasn't something you truly owned. You simply borrowed it long enough to leave it better than you found it. My eyes drifted across the shoreline until they stopped on a polished wooden pavilion with a freshly painted banner stretched across the entrance. Grand Opening Celebration. Hosted by Willow Ridge Homeowners Association. My pulse slowed instead of racing. Somewhere beneath the confusion, beneath the disbelief, a quiet certainty settled into my chest. Whatever had happened while I lay unconscious for 15 months, somebody had mistaken my absence for surrender. I stood there long enough for the morning sun to climb above the oak trees, warming the back of my neck while strangers unfolded lawn chairs where my grandfather once tied his old aluminum fishing boat. Nobody looked at me twice. To them, I was just another visitor arriving late to enjoy a summer Saturday. That was the strangest part. My entire childhood had been erased so completely that even standing on my own shoreline made me invisible. Brooks Lake had never been famous. It was never supposed to be. My grandfather, William Brooks, bought the land in 1968 after returning from years of working highway construction across the Midwest. People thought he was crazy for spending nearly every dollar he had on 112 acres surrounding a quiet spring-fed lake tucked behind rolling hills outside Cedar Falls. They saw swampy shoreline and dense hardwood forest. He saw peace. He built our cabin himself, cutting every beam, pouring every footing, and finishing every porch board after working 10-hour shifts. My father grew up fishing from the same dock, where I caught my first largemouth bass at 8 years old. Every family birthday, every Thanksgiving bonfire, every 4th of July ended beside that water. The smell of cedar smoke mixed with fresh lake air became the scent of home long before I understood what home really meant. When my father passed away, ownership transferred to me without argument, because everyone in our family understood one simple rule. Brooks Lake was never something you sold. It was something you protected until the next generation was ready. That promise shaped my entire life. I became a civil engineer specializing in watershed restoration because of this lake. While other kids spent summers at amusement parks, I spent mine measuring shoreline erosion with my grandfather, learning why healthy wetlands mattered more than expensive seawalls. He always carried an old survey map folded inside the pocket of his denim jacket. Every spring he unfolded it across the hood of his truck, tracing property lines with one weathered finger while reminding me that paper mattered almost as much as principles. He would smile and say, "Land remembers who respects it, Nathan." Back then I thought it was just another one of his old sayings. Standing there now, I realized he had been preparing me for something neither of us expected. The accident had stolen 15 months from my life, but it had also stolen 15 months from the lake. My cousin Daniel visited me every week in the rehabilitation center, filling me in on physical therapy milestones and family birthdays, but nobody mentioned this. Maybe they wanted me focused on learning to walk without getting dizzy. Maybe they assumed the property was exactly as I had left it. Or maybe they simply could not imagine anyone would be bold enough to transform private land into a public attraction. A golf cart rolled past carrying volunteers in matching blue shirts with the Willow Ridge logo stitched across their sleeves. One of them waved cheerfully and handed me a glossy brochure before driving away. I looked down at the paper. Across the front was a professionally designed map showing picnic areas, kayak rentals, swimming zones, volleyball courts, and a bold headline that made the air feel suddenly heavier in my lungs. Discover the community's favorite lake getaway. Community. They had printed it in full color, laminated it, and handed it out like the truth had always belonged to them. I folded the brochure once, then slipped it into my jacket pocket like evidence instead of trash. My grandfather used to say that people revealed more about themselves in what they printed than in what they said. Whoever designed this had invested real money. Professional photography, corporate sponsors, event schedules stretching through Labor Day weekend. This was not a spontaneous neighborhood picnic. This had been planned for months, maybe longer. The sound of high heels clicking across the wooden boardwalk pulled my attention toward the pavilion. A woman stepped onto the deck, carrying herself with the confidence of someone who had never been told no. Crisp white linen pants, navy blazer despite the summer heat, designer sunglasses resting perfectly on blonde hair that looked untouched by the humid morning air. She smiled at everyone she passed, shaking hands, accepting compliments, posing for photographs beside a blue ribbon stretched across the entrance. I did not need anyone to introduce her. Even after 15 months away, I recognized Victoria Hayes immediately. She had been selling houses around Cedar Falls for almost 2 decades before becoming president of Willow Ridge Homeowners Association. If there was a camera nearby, Victoria somehow managed to stand directly in front of it. She loved talking about community values, neighborhood vision, and increasing property appreciation. What she never liked discussing were property lines whenever they stood between her and another development project. 3 years earlier, she had knocked on my cabin door carrying a leather portfolio and a smile polished smoother than lake glass. She offered to purchase 20 acres along the eastern shoreline, explaining that a carefully designed community recreation area would benefit everyone. I politely declined before she even finished her presentation. 6 months later, she returned with a larger offer. I declined again. The third visit ended with her standing on my porch, forcing another smile while saying, "One day you will realize that private ownership should not prevent the community from enjoying natural beauty." I remember answering, "Natural beauty survives because somebody takes responsibility for protecting it." Her smile disappeared before she walked back to her luxury sport utility vehicle without another word. Looking across the beach now, I finally understood why she had never accepted those answers. She had simply decided to wait. Somewhere during the 15 months while doctors monitored my recovery and therapists taught me how to trust my balance again, Victoria apparently concluded that I was never coming back. Maybe she believed the coma would last forever. Maybe someone told her my prognosis looked hopeless. Or maybe my silence created the opportunity she had been waiting for all along. She stepped behind a microphone mounted beneath the pavilion roof, and conversation slowly faded into quiet anticipation. The lake reflected bright morning sunlight behind her as she welcomed families to another celebration of what she proudly called Willow Shores Community Beach. Every sentence earned applause. Every joke drew laughter. She thanked volunteers, local businesses, county partners, and members of the Homeowners Association who had transformed what she described as forgotten land into the region's newest destination. Forgotten land. The words settled heavier than the humid summer air. My eyes drifted beyond the pavilion toward the old sycamore tree where my grandfather carved our family initials nearly 40 years earlier. The tree was still standing. Everything else around it had changed. And as Victoria raised a pair of ceremonial scissors for another photograph, I realized she was celebrating a victory that had never legally belonged to her. I stayed exactly where I was while everyone around me celebrated, because people who believe they have already won usually stop paying attention to who is watching. The steady hum of golf carts rolled back and forth across ground that used to be covered with wildflowers every spring. Fresh tire tracks cut through places where my grandfather and I planted native reeds to protect the shoreline from erosion. Every few minutes another family arrived carrying folding chairs, inflatable tubes, and beach towels, following bright blue signs that directed traffic toward parking lots I knew had never existed before. I slowly walked farther along the shoreline, saying nothing, simply observing. The details became more disturbing with every step. A freshly poured concrete boat ramp extended into the lake where an old fishing cove had once sheltered turtles and herons. Wooden rental kiosks advertised paddleboards by the hour. Electronic payment terminals accepted credit cards, debit cards, and mobile payments. Children lined up outside a snack stand, while volunteers handed out wristbands that read Willow Shores Beach Pass. Near the pavilion, a large bulletin board displayed upcoming concerts, outdoor movie nights, charity swims, and an annual summer festival expected to attract thousands of visitors. This was no temporary event. Someone had invested hundreds of thousands of dollars building an entire business around land they did not own. My engineering instincts took over without asking permission. Years of surveying construction sites trained my eyes to notice things most people ignored. I spotted recently installed drainage pipes disappearing beneath the sand. Electrical conduits fed decorative lighting along the boardwalk. Fresh concrete still showed faint expansion joints that could not have been more than a year old. Wooden retaining walls bordered sections of shoreline where heavy equipment had obviously reshaped the terrain. None of this happened overnight. None of this happened without permits. More importantly, none of it happened without someone making deliberate decisions month after month while I lay unconscious in a hospital bed. A teenage employee smiled as I passed and pointed toward a price board mounted beside the dock. Daily parking, boat launch fees, kayak rentals, pavilion reservations, private event packages. I stared at the numbers longer than I expected. They were not simply enjoying my property. They were monetizing it. Every splash in the water, every rented kayak, every family picnic generated revenue, flowing somewhere into somebody's account. The realization settled over me like cold rain. This had never been about giving neighbors access to nature. It was about creating an attraction that increased surrounding property values while producing steady income under the comforting disguise of community improvement. As I continued walking, I noticed something else that almost made me stop breathing. The old stone property marker near the eastern shoreline was gone. My grandfather installed that granite monument decades ago after a professional boundary survey. It weighed nearly 300 pounds. Nobody accidentally misplaced a marker like that. Someone had intentionally removed it. 50 yards farther down the shore, another marker had disappeared as well. In their place stood decorative flower beds bordered with polished limestone blocks and cheerful landscaping that looked straight out of a luxury resort brochure. Most visitors would admire the flowers without ever realizing what had been erased beneath them. I slipped my phone from my pocket and quietly began taking photographs. Not because I planned to confront anyone today. Not because I was angry enough to make a scene. I photographed every payment kiosk, every retaining wall, every new structure, every missing boundary marker, and every professionally printed sign. By the time the afternoon breeze carried the scent of grilled hamburgers across the lake, one thing had become perfectly clear. Victoria Hayes had not merely taken advantage of my absence. She had built an entire illusion so convincing that everyone around me now believed the lie had always been the truth. I left before sunset without speaking a single word to anyone. The applause behind me faded beneath the sound of tires rolling across the gravel road leading back to my cabin. The house itself looked almost untouched, which somehow made everything feel stranger. The weathered porch swing still hung from the same rusted chains. My grandfather's wind chimes still clinked softly beneath the front eaves whenever the breeze drifted through the maple trees. Even the old mailbox leaned at the same crooked angle beside the driveway. It was as if someone had carefully preserved the house while quietly transforming everything surrounding it. Inside, the familiar scent of cedar, old books, and fireplace ash wrapped around me like an old friend who had waited patiently for my return. Dust floated through narrow beams of evening sunlight as I slowly walked from room to room. Every photograph remained where I had left it before the accident. My father's tackle box rested beneath the hallway bench. My grandfather's fishing hat still hung beside the kitchen door. Nothing inside suggested that the outside world had rewritten history. I poured myself a glass of water, sat at the old oak table, and unfolded the glossy brochure beside a county map I had kept for years. The two looked like they described completely different places. That was when another memory surfaced. During rehabilitation, Daniel had mentioned stopping by the cabin several times after the accident. He said neighbors were always around the lake, but I had assumed he meant fishermen or hikers. Neither of us imagined he was describing a commercial beach operated by the Homeowners Association. I picked up my phone and called him. He answered on the second ring, sounding genuinely relieved to hear my voice. When I asked about the beach, the silence lasted several seconds. Finally, he sighed. He admitted everything had happened gradually. First came volunteers cleaning litter around the shoreline. Then temporary picnic tables appeared. After that, county commissioners attended a public ceremony celebrating what Victoria called a community revitalization project. Every month another improvement appeared until people stopped questioning who actually owned the land. Daniel confessed he always believed the project had official approval because everyone involved acted so confidently. He even assumed I had authorized it through someone managing my affairs while I remained hospitalized. I thanked him for his honesty instead of blaming him. Confusion spreads quickly when nobody checks facts. After hanging up, I unlocked the small office my grandfather built behind the kitchen. The room smelled exactly the way I remembered. Old paper, machine oil, leather folders, and pine shelves darkened by decades of afternoon sunlight. Filing cabinets lined one wall. Survey equipment occupied another. Every drawer carried handwritten labels in my grandfather's careful block letters. Shoreline surveys, water records, easements, tax documents. I ran my hand across the worn metal handles, feeling years of dust gather on my fingertips. Something inside me shifted. Until that moment, I had been reacting emotionally, trying to understand how this could happen. Sitting in that quiet office, surrounded by the habits of a man who trusted documentation more than arguments, I remembered exactly who had taught me to solve impossible problems. My grandfather never panicked when something looked wrong. He searched until the facts spoke louder than opinions. I opened the first cabinet and began reading, page after page, as the last light disappeared beyond the trees. Outside, music from the lakeside celebration drifted faintly through the open window. They laughed, they celebrated, and they believed the story they had created would last forever. They had no idea that somewhere beneath the dust of an old filing cabinet, the real story had been waiting patiently for me to come home. The office clock had stopped years ago at 4:17, yet somehow the silence inside that room felt perfectly alive. Every drawer I opened carried another piece of my grandfather's life, each folder organized with the kind of discipline that came from believing future generations deserved clear answers instead of unanswered questions. The rough texture of aging file folders scraped against my fingertips while the smell of yellowed paper mixed with cedar shelves that had absorbed 50 years of quiet winters. Around midnight, I reached the bottom drawer of the oldest filing cabinet. Unlike the others, this one did not slide open easily. Something heavy inside resisted until I pulled harder. A narrow steel lockbox sat in the back corner beneath stacks of faded engineering maps. The combination came back to me immediately. My birthday, my father's birthday, my grandfather's birthday. 3 generations connected by 6 simple numbers. The lock clicked open with a sound so crisp it echoed through the room. Inside rested documents sealed inside waterproof sleeves, each one labeled in my grandfather's handwriting. Original warranty deed. Certified boundary survey. Repair and water rights. State environmental easement. Federal wetland registration. I carefully spread them across the oak desk, my pulse slowing as years of engineering training replaced emotion with analysis. Every legal description matched the survey stakes I remembered installing with my grandfather when I was 16. Every shoreline measurement aligned with county records dating back decades. Nothing surprised me until I unfolded one oversized survey map tucked beneath the others. Attached with a rusted paperclip was a yellow legal memo dated April 12, 1972. The heading immediately caught my attention. Special Conservation Covenant. I had never seen it before. The language was surprisingly simple. My grandfather had voluntarily entered a perpetual conservation agreement with the state to preserve the natural shoreline in exchange for permanent tax incentives and watershed protection assistance. One paragraph had been highlighted in blue ink. Any commercial development, recreational construction, shoreline modification, or public access project affecting the protected waterfront required written authorization from the recorded property owner together with approval from the State Department of Natural Resources before any permit could become legally effective. I read the paragraph 3 times, then a fourth. The room suddenly felt warmer. Every retaining wall, every boardwalk, every parking lot, every rental kiosk, every truckload of imported sand, every permit associated with those projects depended on one signature that could never have existed. Mine. I was lying unconscious in a hospital bed while every stage of construction supposedly received legal authorization. That impossible contradiction sat quietly on the page like it had been waiting for me all along. Then I noticed another envelope tucked beneath the covenant. It contained correspondence between my grandfather and the State Conservation Office spanning nearly 20 years. One letter ended with a handwritten note in the margin. Nathan, if anyone ever tries to convince you this lake belongs to everyone, remember that stewardship and ownership are not the same thing. The law protects both when people are willing to read it. I leaned back in the old wooden chair and listened to the distant sound of music drifting across the dark water outside. They had built an entire business believing they had buried the truth beneath fresh sand and polished boardwalks. Instead, they had built it directly on top of a legal covenant that had never disappeared. They simply never knew it existed. For the first time since waking from 15 months of darkness, I smiled. Not because I had won. Not yet. I smiled because I finally understood something my grandfather had always believed. Facts do not panic. They wait. I did not call a lawyer the next morning. I did not march into the Homeowners Association office waving old documents. I did not confront Victoria Hayes in front of her volunteers. People expect anger because anger is predictable. My grandfather taught me something far more useful. Let people finish building the story they want the world to believe before you quietly introduce the truth. For the next 2 weeks, I became almost invisible. Every morning, I drove my old pickup to a public turnout overlooking the lake just after sunrise. The cool air carried the smell of fresh coffee, damp earth, and sunscreen long before the first families arrived. I sat with a notebook on the passenger seat, writing down everything. Delivery trucks, landscaping crews, maintenance schedules, vendor arrivals, portable restroom service, security patrols. Every golf cart followed nearly identical routes at nearly identical times. Every evening, I walked the shoreline with my camera, photographing every improvement from the exact same angles. Construction dates hidden beneath electrical panels, manufacturer labels on floating docks, permit stickers attached to power boxes. Even the decorative lighting revealed installation dates stamped beneath the metal housings. Years of engineering inspections had trained my eyes to notice details that most people never considered important. Details become timelines. Timelines become evidence. I also visited the county courthouse without announcing who I was. The clerk behind the records counter recognized my last name immediately and smiled with genuine surprise after hearing I had recovered. I simply requested copies of every permit, zoning application, shoreline improvement request, and environmental filing connected to Brooks Lake during the previous 2 years. The stack grew thicker with every folder the clerk placed beside me. Most documents appeared routine until I noticed something impossible. Every major approval referenced written authorization from the property owner, yet no original authorization letter appeared anywhere in the file. Only photocopies attached to later submissions. I quietly ordered certified copies of everything. Back at the cabin, I compared signatures beneath a magnifying lamp my grandfather once used for reading survey plats. The signatures looked convincing from across the room. Up close, they told a different story. The pressure marks varied. Letter spacing shifted unnaturally. One signature even included a flourish I had stopped using nearly 10 years earlier after changing professional licensing documents. Whoever assembled those papers copied old examples instead of current ones. I placed every observation into labeled folders, refusing to jump ahead. Facts first, conclusions later. Meanwhile, Victoria became even more ambitious. Billboards appeared along the state highway promoting the upcoming Willow Shores Summer Festival. Local radio stations advertised live music, food trucks, paddleboard races, fireworks, and what they proudly called the largest community lake celebration in the county. Sponsors lined up. Television crews announced attendance estimates approaching 5,000 visitors. Watching those advertisements almost made me laugh. They were investing even more money into a project balanced on paperwork that became weaker every single day I spent verifying it. Daniel stopped by one evening carrying barbecue and asked why I had not confronted anyone yet. I handed him 2 nearly identical signature pages beneath the desk lamp. After several quiet seconds, he looked up with raised eyebrows. "These are not the same signature." I nodded. Then I slid the conservation covenant beside the permit applications. His expression changed completely. "Nathan," he whispered, "they have no idea what they built this on." I closed the final folder, stacked every document in chronological order, and looked through the office window toward the lights glowing across the lake. They believed the biggest day in Willow Shores history was only 3 weeks away. I agreed. We simply had very different reasons for looking forward to it. The morning of the Willow Shores Summer Festival arrived with cloudless skies and the kind of perfect weather every event organizer dreams about. By 8 o'clock, the county road was already packed with sport utility vehicles, pickup trucks, and minivans stretching nearly half a mile from the entrance. The smell of smoked barbecue drifted across the lake, while live country music echoed from speakers mounted around the pavilion. Volunteers hurried between vendor tents carrying boxes of bottled water and festival maps. Children laughed as they raced toward the floating swim platform. Television reporters adjusted their cameras beside banners celebrating what Victoria Hayes proudly called the greatest community achievement in Willow Ridge history. I parked my truck beneath the same sycamore tree where my grandfather once taught me to skip stones and watched everything unfold exactly as I had expected. At precisely 9:30, Victoria stepped onto the main stage wearing a bright blue blazer embroidered with the Homeowners Association logo. She thanked sponsors, local officials, and community volunteers for transforming what she again described as forgotten land into a destination the entire county could enjoy. The applause rolled across the water like distant thunder. Then something changed. 2 white pickup trucks bearing the State Department of Natural Resources seal slowly entered the parking lot. Behind them came 3 county inspection vehicles. A marked sheriff's office sport utility vehicle followed at a calm, steady pace. No lights, no sirens, just quiet professionalism. Conversations around the entrance gradually softened as uniformed officials stepped out carrying clipboards, survey tubes, and document cases. A few moments later, another vehicle arrived displaying the county planning and development emblem. Victoria's confident smile flickered for the first time that morning before quickly returning as she walked toward the officials with an outstretched hand. From where I stood, I could not hear every word, but I recognized the moment one inspector removed a large rolled survey from its protective tube and spread it across a folding table. Another official placed certified copies of permit applications beside the original conservation covenant I had delivered 3 days earlier. The expressions around that table changed almost immediately. Survey measurements were compared. Property descriptions matched. Signatures examined. One by one, officials quietly walked toward different structures around the beach. Bright orange notices appeared on the boardwalk entrance. Another was attached to the rental kiosk. More followed on the pavilion, the boat ramp, the parking lot entrance, and the floating dock access gate. The music stopped halfway through a song. Vendor conversations faded into uncertain whispers. Families began reading the posted notices while event volunteers looked toward Victoria for answers she clearly did not have. The festival did not end with shouting or chaos. It ended with paperwork. Inspectors explained that protected shoreline improvements required approvals that could not be verified. Commercial operations could not continue during the investigation, and access to several newly constructed areas had to be suspended immediately pending legal review. Contractors hired by the Homeowners Association quietly lowered their heads as they listened. Television cameras that had arrived to celebrate ribbon cuttings now recorded inspectors measuring retaining walls and photographing missing boundary markers. I remained beneath the sycamore tree until one senior state official walked directly toward me carrying the original survey map in both hands. He stopped, extended the folder, and said with calm professionalism, "Mr. Brooks, thank you for preserving these records." They answered every question we needed answered. I accepted the folder without saying much because there was nothing left to argue. Across the shoreline, Victoria stood silently watching the orange notices flutter in the breeze above the same imported sand she once believed would permanently bury the truth. Instead, every document my grandfather carefully protected for decades had quietly done exactly what he always trusted it would do. It remembered. 37 days later, the shoreline looked almost the way I remembered it. The imported sand had been carefully removed. The temporary rental kiosks were gone. The floating platforms had disappeared from the water, leaving only gentle ripples reflecting the early morning sky. Fresh native grasses had already begun reclaiming sections of the bank where heavy equipment once sat. Restoration crews hired through the state's environmental program worked quietly instead of hurriedly, following conservation plans that had existed long before anyone imagined building a commercial beach. The only sounds were birds settling into the reeds and the familiar splash of fish breaking the glassy surface just beyond the old dock. I sat on the weathered bench my grandfather built nearly 30 years earlier, holding a cup of black coffee while cool autumn air carried the scent of cedar and damp leaves across the lake. For the first time since waking in that hospital room, everything felt steady again. The legal process continued for months, but the biggest questions had already been answered. Independent investigators determined that multiple shoreline improvements had moved forward without satisfying the conservation covenant attached to the property. Several permits required correction. Construction approvals were withdrawn. Commercial operations permanently ended. Insurance companies began reviewing claims connected to unauthorized improvements. Contractors shifted responsibility toward consultants. Consultants pointed toward the Homeowners Association. Every organization started following the paper trail that my grandfather had preserved decades before. Victoria Hayes resigned as Homeowners Association president before the annual board election. Her real estate advertisements quietly disappeared from local magazines over the following weeks. Eventually, another board took over, beginning every public meeting with one simple promise. Property rights would be respected before development plans were discussed. I never attended those meetings. I had no interest in watching people apologize after the facts had already spoken. Daniel visited one afternoon carrying fishing poles just like we used to when we were teenagers. We spent hours drifting across the calm water without talking very much. Sometimes silence says more than conversation ever could. As the sun settled lower, he looked toward the restored shoreline and smiled. "Your grandfather would have liked this." I nodded because I knew exactly what he meant. Not the victory, not the investigations, not the legal documents. He would have appreciated seeing the lake breathe again. Before leaving, I walked to the old sycamore tree and brushed my hand across the faded initials carved into the bark so many years ago. Time had softened the edges, but they were still there, just like the truth hidden inside forgotten filing cabinets and folded survey maps. People often believe ownership is about fences, signs, or loud declarations. My grandfather taught me something different. Ownership begins with responsibility. Responsibility creates stewardship, and stewardship leaves behind records that outlive ambition. I looked across the quiet water one last time before heading back toward the cabin. 15 months had disappeared from my life, and I will never get those days back. But the lake was still here, protected exactly the way my family intended. In the end, nobody won because they shouted the loudest. Nobody prevailed because they held the biggest celebration or printed the nicest brochures. The truth endured because someone cared enough to preserve it long before anyone else realized it would matter. Justice never arrived with flashing lights or dramatic speeches. It arrived inside old folders, careful handwriting, accurate surveys, and patient facts that simply refused to change. And as the first leaves of autumn drifted onto the water, I finally understood why my grandfather never worried about people trying to take what belonged to us. He trusted that the land would always remember who came home to protect it.